forensics and their assistance in homicide investigations. I presume that's kind of where I come in. Forensic advances have been tremendous in the last few years. As a matter of fact, I tell people all the time that they've advanced more in the last 2 years than in the previous 20 put together. So there are, of course, most of that is DNA testing. The advances in DNA testing include how you collect the DNA, the amount you can collect from DNA, and what you can do with it once you find it. The fact that you can, when I first became a detective in 1990, they were using RFLP DNA. And you had to have a biological sample about the size of a coin, a large coin, for it to be useful. And there was no central data bank. And so it helped if you had somebody in mind and you did happen to have a large biological sample. But if you didn't, there was no such thing as touch DNA. At least it wasn't. Nobody could develop touch DNA back then. Touch DNA itself was a huge forward step in forensics. The thing I like to talk about is so the methods of collection. Before, you would cut and swab, and you'd run the swab over something, assuming that thing wasn't so porous that it didn't destroy the swab, or the DNA wasn't too far inside. Now, the latest system to collect DNA is the Mvac, wet vacuuming DNA collection system, which is a piece of equipment about the size of a carry-on luggage. It's portable and it has nozzles on it. And what it does is it squirts a sterile solution into the evidence and then vacuums it right back up. It goes into a reservoir. Once you're done with that piece of evidence, you take that liquid out of the reservoir and there's a filter, and you pour the liquid through the filter, and that filter traps the DNA that you've sucked up. Tests have been done by the FBI recently about the use of the Mvac, and they found that the Mvac, just initially using the Mvac, gets as much as 4,600% more DNA than cutting or swabbing. 4,600%. Between 12 and 4,600%. So significantly more. There's, like from the time you swab evidence before it gets to the lab, it loses like 80% of the DNA. But this doesn't, because it's in this filter. And they test the filter and it comes out, and you can get DNA off surfaces you could never get off before, like rocks or bricks or some clothing, some things that have been underwater for a while. There was a case of a woman who was a girl, actually, a young girl, found drowned and murdered in her bathtub. She was underwater. And they were able to, as a cold case, go back and pull that evidence and MVAC it. And they found the killer's DNA on that, ended up being the apartment manager where she lived, and he was convicted of the crime. Or, like I said, rocks. That was a case in Utah where a woman's body was found alongside a river, and there was a bloody rock next to her. Her head was bashed in. She'd obviously been murdered with a rock. Of course, they swabbed the rock, couldn't get anything off of it, and it became a cold case. Years and years later, they took the MVAC and MVAC'd the rock, and were able to get DNA, and that DNA was matched with a guy who was in the DNA databank, and he was arrested and convicted of a murder many years after it occurred. So that's the advantage of it. There's an attachment on the DNA, on the MVAC for skin, so you can do it on humans, and it isn't too hard on them. I mean, living humans, a rape victim, for example, even a rape victim who has showered, they've used the MVAC with the human skin attachment and recovered enough DNA to be useful in a case. But you can get them off bodies, obviously, if they're during autopsy. If you have a manual strangulation, you MVAC the neck. Assuming the person wasn't wearing gloves or something, there's going to be touch DNA there. So ropes. The other thing that MVAC is really good for is tape, like duct tape. Because it can do both sides. It can do the sticky side and the outside. Regular swabbing cannot do the sticky side of duct tape because it destroys the swab. So those are some advantages of the other thing is you could do a large area. Say you're at a scene and there's a dead body there, and there just happens to be a boulder next to it's outside. you can do a large area of that boulder and see if you pick up any DNA off it in case the guy put his hand on the boulder. Those are huge advancements that were never available before. And once you have the DNA, of course, you can then do so much more with it. You can use it takes much less DNA to get a sample now than it used to. And now it's microscopic. A few cells is enough to get a profile instead of the large biological sample. It doesn't have to be a lot biological sample. It can be touch. And then when you get that, you compare it to the CODIS data bank in the US. I don't know if they have, I'm sure they have something similar in India, but it's a data bank of all known felons who presumably are in there. And I say presumably because there's some lag where people aren't being put in there that should be there, and everybody's trying to get that backlog filled. But that will pull up a name of a possible person. And then you have to, of course, make a one-on-one swab of that person, either getting their DNA by a warrant, doing a cheek swab, or following them surreptitiously and getting something that they discard that would have their DNA on it. Assuming that isn't in the CODIS data, you have a DNA profile, but it's not in the CODIS data bank, then there are other ways to do it. Of course, you can do familial DNA, where it'll show if any close relatives of the suspect are in any data bank, which could lead you to the correct person. And of course, genealogy is the latest thing in the last couple of years, and that's a huge breakthrough. The difference is with genealogy, the DNA process is different. It's not PCR DNA or that they use for forensic DNA. It's SNP is what has to be developed. So you need raw DNA to do it to begin with. And then that DNA is processed in that SNP method and compared against public databases of people that are doing Ancestry.com or 23andMe or any of those things. It's actually in GenX is the name of the big data bank where some of that stuff gets put. And you can trace it back. They trace it to any relative. They score them. The genealogist scores it, and it has to reach a certain threshold before it's something usable. But it may be, again, maybe they do there and they don't find anything usable. But if you wait 6 or 7 months and go back, try it again, because somebody in the family might have had this done in the meantime. But then they trace it, and these genealogists, they're literally like, I've met a couple of them. They're like Miss Marple, the little old lady that's solving murders, because they're just people that do this, and they didn't, they weren't really, when they got into it, probably weren't thinking forensically. But they'll go back and trace a family tree using public records, marriage certificates, death certificates, birth certificates, and actually build the tree. And they'll try to narrow it to a few people. Usually, obviously you're going to know if it's male or female, and it's almost always male in these type of cases, but because of the Y chromosome. So they'll trace it down to that family tree through marriage and divorce. Of course, the problems they have are sometimes there's adoptions. Like this person's related to another person, but the person they're related to has no idea who they are because they were adopted as an infant. So then they have to kind of go back and try to find adoption records or what happened, who had a baby that was born, but then it wasn't raised with the family or anything. So that's another hurdle they go through. And once they narrow it down, usually to 3 or 4 males in one family tree, then the detective has to do the detective work. He has to look at it and say, well, why is there any reason any of these people could not be the person? They were dead at the time of the murder. They were in prison at the time of the murder, lived on the other side of the world or something at the time of the murder. And if they can, they eliminate 1 or 2. But if they can't, then they have to go after all 4, or presuming the number's 4. And so that's what they do. Then they have to go find those people and get a DNA sample, either request one or surreptitiously get one, just like before. So that's what they'll do, and they'll find it. Once they find the one and get that DNA surreptitiously, say for example, off a coffee cup, a paper coffee cup that the person disposed of, and they picked it up, and the lab says, yes, this is the right guy. Now you have to go get a warrant, and you have to go get that guy, and you have to do a one-on-one swab. People ask me all the time, well, does this genealogical DNA hold up in court? It doesn't have to, because it's not evidence. It's just a lead. It's no different than if you put out information about a crime and somebody picked up a phone and said, hey, my neighbor looks like that guy, I think it might be him. And you looked at the neighbor and it ended up being him. It's no different. That call is not evidence, it's a lead. And that's the same with genealogy. It's just telling you, look at these people. And you look at them until you find the right one. And then the only evidence is the actual verification swab you took at the end. And so that's something that is very valuable. There was a case in my area a year or two ago where the genealogist, in a terrible murder of a young boy and girl came down from Canada, but they were, the genealogist said, this is your guy. That's what she pointed to the detective. And he goes, what do you mean this is my guy? Because she specifically said one person, because he was the only male in his tree for several generations. And so that's the guy. So they just focused on him. He was a truck driver and he's driving his truck, and they had detectives following him. Excuse me. One time he stopped the truck, opened his truck door and stepped out. A coffee cup fell out, a paper coffee cup. Got in the truck, drove away. They picked up a coffee cup. That was the confirmation. They went and got his DNA, got a warrant, got him, arrested him, got his DNA, and it verified it was him. And that went to trial and he was convicted. And that was like 20 or 30 years after the fact. So that's the thing about these cold cases with all these forensic advancements, is there's evidence sitting in police stations all over the world that's just sitting there that somebody needs to go pull down and have it tested again for DNA. Well, when I review cold cases, I'll ask about stuff that needs to have DNA done, and I'll hear, we did DNA. They didn't find anything. Well, when did you do the DNA? Oh, we did it like 10 years ago. Well, then you didn't do it. You need to do it all over again, because it's a completely different method now. It's different. It's so much more advanced, so far less needed to process. So that's what detectives have to do. They have to go and get DNA and, get their evidence and have it all retested. There are other things like, one of the big problems has always been fired shell casings and trying to get DNA off that, and they could swab them, but you'd get, first of all, the chances of finding usable DNA on a swab is maybe 8-10%, right? Well, they have a woman who has an Mvac system, a criminalist named Francine Bardot thought, I wonder if I took those casings and put them in the solution and just agitated the solution for a few minutes and then poured that through the filter, if I'd get more DNA. And she did, and she got significantly more DNA, up to like 20 or 30% of them, instead of the 8 to 10%. It's just more than double, maybe even triple the amount she was getting before. And that's because a swab can't get in all the little crevices and all the little places that the DNA may be, but by agitating like that in the liquid and then pouring it in the filter, it does capture that. And so those are huge things. Fingerprints off fired casings, that's a real problem. And I was a homicide detective for 22 years. In that 22 years, I never once got a good fingerprint off a fired casing. You can get them off unfired casings, but not fired casings, probably because it superheats and it kind of evaporates the liquid or the body fluids on there. But the guy in England, I forgot his name, who developed the way to chemically treat it, where he gets 8 to 10% of the time he can find it, because it's embedded in the side of the casing. That one's been out for about 10 years now, but those are all advancements. These are things that are going on all the time. People are making huge discoveries. Like I said, I can't be more excited about the Mvac and genealogy and all those things. Mvac, by the way, if somebody is interested, it's m-vac.com is their website. You can go there and they have examples of cases that worked out when somebody used that. The state I'm in, Washington State in the U.S., the state has about 8 of them, and they've been using them for a couple of years now, having success. Then you get, of course, the problem is you get so much DNA, sometimes you get mixtures. Then you have to use something to sort out the mixtures, like TrueAllele or one of those programs that you can sort out the who is who on these cases. I mean, there have been cases where people were underwater, like I said. Getting DNA off clothing that had been underwater for a few hours was unheard of before, but you can sometimes get usable DNA with the MVAC and things like that. And the more you can do with it is incredible. Do you have any questions about anything or anything else you'd like me to talk about? There are different types of murders. There are cases that are going to be forensic murders, and there are ones that are, not necessarily forensic. Some are more than others. I mean, if you get a gang shooting or something, there are forensics because there's ballistics and bullets, but they're usually from a distance away, so you don't have that. But when you have, there's two different ways. There's the way the detective works as when he gets to the scene on a fresh murder and decides what should be collected as evidence, and tells his people, I need this collected, I need that collected, then looks around, what could the guy have touched, and maybe make sure you get those areas. And if it's something that's too big to take as evidence or too heavy, then if you have an MVAC, have it brought to the scene and MVAC that system. And then, you go through and prioritize what you want. The other thing about the MVAC, which is really good, speaking of it, is like strangulation, ligature strangulation. Well, you're going to get, if it's a rope or, on the ends, the guy's gripping very hard, there's going to be a lot of cell transfer on the ends of that. So you're going to want to have those ends MVAC'd or examined. You could try to swab them or cut them, but you're not going to have the success. Like I said at the beginning, between 1,200 and 4,600% more DNA is collected using the MVAC wet vacuuming system than by cutting or swabbing. So I wouldn't bother with the ones that are going to give you less. If you have a system, you have to have the system first, obviously. If you have it, use it, and you'll have much more chance of success. So that's one of the things you might look at. It's a rope. This is the rope the person was strangled with. Maybe it's still around their neck, or a belt. We need to do you do the whole thing because you can with an MVAC. See, when you're talking about a shirt or something where the person touched, when you were doing cutting or swabbing, you had to make an educated guess where the person touched that victim and they'd cut out small samples there, but you might be wrong. You could be only off by an inch, but it's not going to show up when you're cutting or you're swabbing. So the MVAC can do a much larger area, and the chances of you getting the right spot are much greater. And so then you're going to be able to collect the DNA. You're going to have the victim's DNA on there, obviously, too. The other thing is, if you got something like if you can see blood, if you can see semen, you don't need the MVAC for that. You can swab that, right? Because it's going to be full of DNA. You don't need to MVAC areas where you can physically see the evidence with your eyes. It's the stuff that's microscopic that you need it for, that you can't see. And you're only making educated guesses about where it would be using logic. This person probably did this, or something's been moved. This was here, now it's over there. Let's take that and let's have that processed for DNA. The clothing of the victim, ligatures, weapons. If there's a knife at the scene, the handle of the knife. If there's a gun at the scene, the grip of the gun. And gloves at the scene. If the person wears gloves but gets rid of them, then the inside of the gloves is where you're going to find DNA. Another thing is, on these cold cases especially, if let's say they searched for fingerprints and dusted fingerprints, and maybe they didn't find anything but smudges, but they have the fingerprint cards and evidence, you take those fingerprint cards and you peel back the tape, the person's DNA is going to be underneath that. It's contained. So do the inside of those cards for DNA. You wouldn't use MVAC in that situation because it would destroy the card or the tape, but process those for DNA. Is probably going to be there. Well, somebody's DNA, whoever's smudges on there is going to be there. That doesn't mean it's the killer. Just like anytime you find DNA at a scene or a fingerprint at the scene of a crime, it doesn't mean it's the killer's, right? You have to figure out, is there a legitimate reason this evidence could have been put there? Is this person whose DNA we found a victim, a friend of the victim's, family member? That makes crimes where one family member kills another more difficult, because unless you can find where their DNA shouldn't be, like on the weapon, but just finding something around the house doesn't necessarily mean that they did it, because they might have been at the house, their family or friends. So it has to be, of course, if you find a fingerprint in blood, that's a good sign. But those are the type of things you look for, and you're just scanning the scene, looking for evidence that you find using your logic. You stand there I used to do this to every murder. When I first got there, I would just stand at a doorway and just scan the room with my eyes. What do I see? And I'm not looking, I might glance at the body, but I'm looking at stuff, other stuff. I'm looking at furniture that might have been moved. I'm looking for things that were discarded. I'm looking for, checkbooks that may have been messed with. Maybe there's checks missing, things like that. So that's what you have to do. You have to do that first. And then you slowly start working your way in toward the body. And what do I see on the body? What kind of wounds do I see? That's why I want to go to the autopsy to see exactly how the wounds happened. Then I'll know. Because the other thing is, you have to go to the scene as a detective. You have to go, because later on, when somebody's describing something to you about the scene, you'll know and picture in your eyes what they're talking, in your mind, excuse me, what they're talking about. But if you've never been there, you have no idea. You have no idea. They could be lying completely, and you would have no idea because you don't know what it looks like. And so, if you've ever read a book about a place or seen something about a place and then went there yourself and realized, man, this looks a lot different than I thought. It's a lot smaller than I thought it was, things like that. That's the type of stuff. I remember I went, when I was in Los Angeles for work one day, I went down to where the O.J. Simpson murder happened, to the condo where Nicole Brown Simpson was murdered in the entryway. And I was really surprised how small it was. I was expecting some big, huge place, and it wasn't. Again, I was in work in Boulder, Colorado, and I went to John Benet Ramsey's house. I, in my mind, pictured this huge mansion, but it's not. It's just a regular size house on a regular street. It goes deep back, but it's not huge. And it was on, Frat Row, where a bunch of fraternities for the University of Colorado were. So that's why you have to go there. You have to see it for yourself. So when someone is discussing something, what do they know? And that works into worrying about false confessions too. If a person, when a person is describing a crime like that to you, they usually know facts that are not known publicly, little tiny things like that. So they mention something that is true, but it wasn't in the news or anything, then this is your right guy. But if they can't describe the layout accurately because they haven't been there, or they can't describe things that were in the room, then I'd look at their confession with a little of a jaundiced eye. We had a serial killer one time back in the 90s, and he was killing prostitutes around Seattle. And one of the things he said is, I bumped my head against a tree branch that had a beer can stuck on it. Well, we knew there was a tree branch at the scene where the victim was found with a beer can on it, because we had it in our pictures. We'd been there. We saw it. If that told us this guy was there. At the time, he was trying to say he was with the killer, but ended up later being the killer himself. But so this guy was there. But then this guy tried to confess, once he confessed to the first couple, to crimes of other murders of women in the area that he didn't do. I don't know why. Maybe to make himself look like a bigger badass. I don't know. But he couldn't describe the intimate detail of the scene or the layout or which direction the body was laying. Most people, when they involved in something like this, it's in their mind. It's burned into their psyche. So they know, they can tell you. And they can tell you over and over, So that's what you got to look for when you're talking about a confession. If the person doesn't seem to know little details that a person who was there should know, then that's a red flag. Another thing is, if it's somebody that's never done anything like this before, I had a guy that was involved in a robbery and murder. This guy was in his 40s, no criminal history at all, but they'd stabbed this victim to death. And I asked him to tell me about it. And he said, well, the knife wasn't working that well. And that rings true, because it's not as easy as TV shows you to get a knife into a body. It hits bone, it hits other things. He said, I couldn't get it to work. That's right. So that's a sign of truthfulness. And there were other things, the layout of the apartment, where it was, how you got to it once you walked in the door, and things like that he could tell me that somebody who wasn't the killer couldn't. So you have to get those details in your confession to show this is the right guy, stuff that only the killer would know. And that's forensics too. That's forensic interviewing, basically, or interrogation. It's all evidence, right? If this person's telling you stuff, but if they can't tell you, if they're wrong about where things were in the apartment, or they can't tell you, I don't mean, they can be wrong about one or two small things, but if they can't tell you what it looked like, that should raise red flags. And you should really, look at that differently. There's a lot of reasons people make false confessions. A lot of them are just crazy people, but sometimes non-crazy people do too. And I don't know why, but you just got, that's how you guard against that false confession, is by looking for things, ask them to describe specific things. Well, which way did the door open? From the left or from the right? What was inside the apartment? How do you get there when you walk in the door? Uh, what kind of cars were in the driveway? Or what color was the house? These type of things. And some of the stuff, that's the mistake that some small agencies make, is that they put everything on the news, every piece of evidence they have, and it just, it's a mistake, because then you lose some of that stuff. When I was interrogating murder suspects, sometimes what I would do, if they were lying about it, if I was sure they were guilty, but they were lying about what they were doing, I would tell them that I had a piece of evidence and describe the evidence to them that I didn't really have. And what I'm doing is seeing if they'll adjust their story to account for that piece of evidence. If they start, like, I found your fingerprints on a book at the house. Oh, yeah, I borrowed that book once or something. Well, the book wasn't really there. I'm making this up, right? So I'm looking for them. I want them to change their story to adjust for the evidence that I'm telling them I have when I really don't have it. So those are things you got to look out in interrogations too. I don't know what else I could talk about in your old cases. Have somebody, if not you, somebody else go back. And if you're not that experienced, ask for help. Ask for help from an agency that is more experienced, or, and I'm the director of investigations for the American Investigative Society of Cold Cases. And it's a national society in the US where agencies from all over the country submit their cases to us for review. And we have people of different expertise areas: investigation, lab, psychological, and all those type of things, and geographical profiling. And then we all, tear through the case and talk about it, and then prepare a report actually, and send it back to the agency. And you need to do these things. But then it's up to the agency to actually do those things. Sometimes we do this all, and we send it, we don't ever hear that they did it. Well, you got to actually do what's suggested. So but if you have it and you're confident in yourself, go back and pull out the evidence of those old cases and look at them again, like it's the first time you've ever seen it. What could I put now, knowing what evidence I have today, or what forensic techniques I have today? What could I do with this? Where would I likely find evidence on this? And you know what? A big chunk of them, you're gonna find evidence, and you're gonna clear these old cases. And that's what you have to do.